Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. A quick question for you. When was the last time you stopped and thought about campus spirit? Not just cheering at a game, but what actually makes a campus feel welcoming to everyone? I recently asked this question on LinkedIn, and the responses got me thinking, and I decided it's worth a deeper conversation. Here's the tension. When big money dominates college athletics, how do smaller programs keep students and leadership focused on the broader campus experience and create what we call spirit? We tend to use school spirit as a stand-in for athletics, packed stadiums, fired up fans, rivalries, mascots, and that leads many campus leaders to a familiar question. Should we invest more in sports to build pride and community? And will that draw in more students? Today, we'll dig into those questions using the latest research from the Art and Science Group. Joining me are Craig Goebel and David Strauss, principals at Art and Science Group, leaders in using empirical research to guide strategic decisions for colleges nationwide. Craig focuses on matching what students want with what colleges offer, using data to set prices and position schools. Craig, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Karen.
And David uses advanced data methods to help colleges improve institutional strategy and use their resources more effectively. David, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
So this is a fascinating study, and I am going to link it in the show notes for this if anybody wants to check it out. But let me just give a brief overview before we dive into the conversation. This is a March 2026 student poll. That's what it's called, student poll. Surveyed 1,481 high school seniors, focusing on school spirit and athletics among college-bound students at all four-year schools. It reveals students define school spirit broadly. They emphasize campus unity, traditions, and pride over athletics alone, with only 39% rating strong sports culture as highly important in college decisions. Athletics participation is limited, about 18% plan varsity involvement, yet it signals broader engagement and varying by demographics like politics and institution type. And the politics thing is very interesting. So who would like to start? Just kind of give us a sense of what generated this study.
Sure. So I'll start off, Karen. In the normal line of work, David and I and others at our firm speak with a lot of college presidents about their strategic priorities in trying to understand how they can strengthen their positions overall. And not too surprisingly, that often comes down to questions around school spirit and the athletics program. Certainly, I think the conversation nationally is guided more by probably the success of a couple dozen institutions in the country, not a couple thousand. And, the SEC and the Big Ten probably lead that conversation, especially with their $1 billion plus payouts that they're reporting out recently.
Yes.
It certainly becomes the envy of many institutions. They see growing demand at those schools. They see increasing selectivity. And so they're curious, is this something that we should be investing in? And
Yeah.
what does it really mean? Does it mean we have to win a national title? Does it mean we need to be competitive each year? Does it mean something more broad? And so we wanted to understand what that it really was. And so we dug in this research with prospective students to understand how they're perceiving, their colleges that they're interested in terms of the athletics and in terms of school spirit.
How are university presidents using data like this student poll to counter enrollment declines from the enrollment cliff starting in 2026, this year?
I think the first thing they should be thinking about is what does it mean on their individual campus? As you said on your introduction, this is really a broad study focused on students who are interested in all different types of institutions. And so how it plays out at a large flagship public in a big conference compared to the small liberal arts college can vary quite widely. But one of the major findings that stood out to us right off the bat was that prospective students really are considering school spirit in very broad terms. Athletics is part of that, but it is not the only thing that is driving their perception of how much school spirit might be at a campus. They're thinking about other things like student engagement at non-athletic events, about a strong sense of unity at these events, even the branding of the institution as visible on campus through signage and sweatshirts and bumper stickers and mascot. Those things all play a role and even extends to the alumni pride, what they're hearing in their community and from others and seeing how how proud people are of that institution plays into that broader conversation of school spirit.
So let's talk a little bit more about demonstrating pride. Did you get any specific examples, or could you share any examples of beyond what you just said, which seems very obvious? I'd love to see the bumper sticker on every car on campus or the sweatshirt on. How can presidents assess that on their current campus, and then how could they make adjustments?
I would say you're looking at two things there, Karen. One, it ultimately affects the experience of students who are at an institution, and it can affect the decisions of students who are considering an institution. But I'd say that's in two ways. One is the attention that athletics might bring to an institution can signal something to students about the experience. How often does one walk down the street and hear someone say to somebody else, "Go blue"? There's something out there in the water
True.
that can
Mm.
affect something. Now, what it's signaling may not be exactly what we think it is, but clearly it's signaling alumni pride. The observation that Craig made earlier, though, is the second piece of this. Institutions can build school spirit sometimes around the ethos that is largely created by athletics. Sometimes it's built around something entirely different. And the pride of alumni can show just as broadly and just as prominently in those instances. That the notion that athletics appear to be a piece of spirit, and spirit appears to be a piece of what's the experience going to be like for me socially. And even that is part of a larger thing that is the combined appeal of an institution that may be, in the case of one institution, different from another, but there are going to be academic characteristics in
Mhm.
terms of perceived quality, perceived nature of the academic experience, and perhaps what the offerings actually are. There are can be other cultural and social aspects of the experience. It can be value perceived and affordability real as another set of criterion. So that I would paint it that way, and
Mhm.
I would paint the pride aspect of this as being powerful across a whole lot of things that include athletics and school spirit.
Okay. So you looked at multiple categories, and one of the ones that I found most interesting was the political angle. You had looked at Republicans and Democrats. And again, these are high school seniors, but you get the sense now, and maybe this has always been true, I don't know, that that plays a larger role in the campus selection experience than we imagined. Can either one of you talk about that a little bit more?
Well, I think it's interesting that one of our first findings that kind of raised our eyebrows was that the number of students that were interested in playing that were playing varsity high school level athletics and planned to play in like D1 was
Mhm.
really quite high, and for them athletics was important. What stood out was when we dug into what they were looking at in terms of determining, whether you had a strong athletics program was certainly things that made sense, like the coaches' reputation, the strength of coaches, the facilities that were offered, the competitiveness of the teams, but equally so, their ability to go on to play professional sports, which we know first of all, a very small percentage of high school varsity athletes get to play
That's right.
competitive D sports, but then to go on to a professional level is even more minuscule of a number. So these student athletes are setting a very high bar for colleges to try to reach. There's not just one or two, three things that they could try to focus on to signal to these student athletes that we really do have strong programs. They
Mhm.
kind of have to go all across the board. And that just seems unrealistic, frankly, for most institutions from a financial perspective.
Yeah. For sure.
The other political point I think that I would observe is while 18% of our respondents, as you noted, indicated that they, as graduating high school seniors, intended to play varsity sports in college. That did vary significantly by or political ideology or affiliation. Um, when we looked at liberal leaning students and self-described moderate students, you had 10 and 11% intending to be intercollegiate student athletes, and conservative leading students, that was 27 versus the 11 and 10. There are some interesting notes there about which we have only hypotheses, but that's a stark enough difference to be meaningful.
And it's further extended when you just look at how important is the athletics culture or sports
Yeah.
culture at a campus. We found overall about a third feel that that's important to them is as they're looking at colleges and universities. But for those who self-identify as conservative and or Republican, it's well over 50%.
Mm.
So it really stood out as being much more important to those students.
I thought that was one of the more interesting takeaways, and I think the logical question would be, well, then, do we need to create more teams, or do we need to create more energy around our teams, or should we think about the non-athletic people who don't come to campus because athletics is here or they want to be an athlete, but they're looking for other things in the culture? So, what might you recommend there?
I would observe that in most of our studies, we find that these athletics considerations are, while influential, are usually not the most influential thing in choice. And so that takes your question and blows it up hugely, if you don't mind my saying, because what we see is that the obstacles that any institution has to getting to its aspirations and having the enrollment that enables them to do that. The biggest obstacles typically aren't directly related to athletics. They may be on a second order level. And what's interesting is that they vary from one institution to another. When we're asked, how are students deciding among colleges these days? We can't answer them. And it's not because we're unable. There is no answer because there is no students. There are different students, that is a market, different competitive sets, that is the consideration set of the students, and different institutions for which some things are credible or not credible. So I'm sorry to run off so long on this, but what one institution must confront is different from what another must confront. Typically, there are things that more often than not are not directly athletics related, but there are places where they are athletics driven, and there are places where athletics is the answer to a larger question.
Okay. Craig, would you like to add to that?
I just would double down on what David said. I mean, it really, the answers can be quite different from institution to institution, even on something that you'd think is relatively low hanging fruit. Like, should we focus on outcomes as one of our primary topics? Sometimes that does help an institution. Other times, students are much more focused on the 4 years they plan to be in college and what that experience looks like rather than just the outcome or the ROI. And so it really is critical to be introspective and think about where are your current strengths? Where have you built that credible strength and reputation as David mentioned? Where are there some areas that you could further leverage that or push in new directions? And how does athletics play into that is a really important question. I'm thinking back 20 years ago, probably, I was having conversations with presidents that were talking about should we invest the extra $5 or $7 million that it takes to keep our athletics program running at a high level. Now it's magnitudes higher than that
Yeah.
at institutions. And so the question becomes really critical. I just recently spoke to a president last week that, their athletics program had always been self-sufficient and now is not in that position anymore.
Yeah.
And the question is, where do we focus our efforts to continue to build our strength in a very challenging market?
And that's why this study is so relevant now. And I know it doesn't provide hardcore answers for everybody, but let's just take the typical small private institution that is enrollment driven, and they've been told repeatedly that the way to solve their problem is to add more athletics teams. Is that the only way, or are there other ways that you might suggest to them to look at strengthening their campus culture and difference, if you will?
Sure. There are instances where strengthening the athletic program at a smaller institution are the answer. There are more instances where they are part of the answer, and there are more still where the primary answer lies elsewhere. So one of the things we've observed is that most small institutions have a significant part of their student bodies made up of student athletes.
Yep.
The coaches are the folks who bring in a large part of the entering class.
Right.
And without that aspect of enrollment, institutions could be in very deep trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the liberal arts colleges where we consult will easily see 25, 30, 35% of the students being student athletes.
Yeah.
We've had a client that where 50% of the student body is student athletes. So this is a huge part of the equation.
Yeah.
The notion that we should just keep building on it is not always right. There are two things that can make that problematic. One, if we get to a point where there are students who are coming in order to play, but they end up as bench warmers, the only reason they were there was to play, and you're not letting them do it, there's a deep danger of lack of commitment to the institution itself and the experience there, and a deep danger, therefore, of attrition of students leaving.
Yeah.
The other potential danger is that if we become defined as the place where student athletes go, it can be a very thin competitive advantage. It can be a very vulnerable one
Mm-hmm.
because athletes can play somewhere else too. So in some instances, we've seen that aspect overdone because, as you noted earlier, resources are sparse. And if we devote all our resources to something on which we're vulnerable, we're putting ourselves in danger.
Oh, it's
So
interesting.
there's a shorthand, hugely critical part of enrollment among small liberal arts colleges, critical numerically, critical to spirit, but it can go too far.
And I think
Okay.
there's some interesting differences by sport too. I mean, I think we probably, in the US focus a lot on football and basketball, given the visibility of those sports. But, at a lot of these small private institutions, they're more focused on soccer and hockey and lacrosse and,
Mm-hmm.
these other sports. And there's some interesting dynamics going on there. There's a huge push to try to be successful. And in doing so, there's a lot of international recruitment going
Yeah.
on
Mm-hmm.
or non-traditional students, where the average age of a team might be 22, 23, 24 years old, not 20. So they're not really bringing in traditional first year students through in these programs. That might create some opportunities for other schools to pick up those students, but there's a weird dynamic going on there. And then as David said, I just can't stress this enough. I think with the portal and the commonplace transfers that happen these days, yes, it's students who sit on the bench all year and say, well, I have an opportunity to play elsewhere, so I'm going because game time is important. But there's also the phenomenon of top performers, and the team didn't do as well as they thought they should do. And so they
Mm.
leave also to go to another team, to another institution, kind of placing the blame on their own team instead of on themselves and how they can
Yeah.
be better leaders and help the rest of the team. So there's some weird dynamics that go on there that make it really difficult to try to build a culture and a strength around that athletics, the student athletes. To me, it makes it all the more critical that we focus on other aspects of their experience too that might keep them there. If they get injured, if they sit on the bench,
Yes.
if the team doesn't do as well as they'd like them to do, how can we make sure that these students are wanting to be here for more than just that game time and that overall success?
Yeah.
Craig's point. Oh, I'm sorry, please.
No, go ahead.
So Craig's point reminds me of a particular story of a small college client where we've worked over the years, where this question of what the culture of the campus is, part of
Mm-hmm.
which is school spirit, part of which is athletics. I found myself in a meeting where a number of faculty members were concerned about a tension they perceived between athletics and academics, and were pointing up what they viewed as a problem between what they perceived as the more intellectually engaged students and the athletes. And in the room was a person on our working group who eventually said, "You may be right that there's a tension, but you're not locating it correctly. I work in the president's office. I'm captain of the soccer team. I'm an athlete. I think you're talking about jocks, not athletes." And I thought it was the most interesting
Yes.
moment telling something that's a much larger story, that when this perception is a common one, that
Yes.
by putting resources into athletics, you are taking resources from other parts of the institution,
Exactly.
and on a more human level, orienting an experience toward the athletes rather than toward the non-athletes is taking something away from the non-athletes. It is certainly conceivable that may be true. But at larger institutions, when you're talking dollars in the billions, that's probably not flowing the wrong way,
Yeah.
those dollars.
Right.
And when
Right.
you're talking about a smaller institution, presence of those student athletes can be critical to institutional health, but also to the experience of non-athletes. It's a much more interesting question to me to wonder about the intellectual versus, if you will, all the pejoratives that folks are thinking about when they think of jocks instead of athletes. I think that's a much more interesting question for a leadership of a college or university to dig its teeth into.
That's a great point. I get so frustrated with that broad brush painting that we've been doing of athletes for 100 years and lumping them all just because they play a sport. They all must be the same. They must have the same intellect. That could not be further from the truth.
We have plenty of clients where the athlete's GPA is at least as high, if not higher, than the non-athletes.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
and in most cases, the persistence rate to graduation, the rate of staying at the place through 4 years, or in some cases 5, is higher among the athletes than
Yeah,
among
yeah,
non-athletes.
yeah.
So those stereotypes can be extraordinarily dangerous.
I know. And I don't want to lump faculty all in that, but it oftentimes feels like faculty can create that dynamic unintentionally in the classroom,
Mhm.
especially if the entire team sits together in the class and they all kind of behave and say they kind of get
Yeah.
lumped together. So that's why coaches are working so hard to get athletes to function differently in the classroom so that they're seen as students first and not necessarily as a group just taking the class for, eligibility or whatever.
Mhm.
That's a great point, David. Craig, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's good.
Okay. All right. So does school spirit predict enrollment? In other words, because Michigan wins the Big Ten title or Indiana wins the Big Ten title, or does it mainly reflect the preferences and priorities of campus? And the same thing for small school. I look at a school like Middlebury, who has won, I think, 7 straight national championships in women's lacrosse. And I think to myself, okay, what kind of culture is being created there? They're still national champions. We don't talk about the school the same way. So what should presidents really think about? And I know you mentioned earlier about coaches and the role that coaches play in creating this environment. So give us a little bit of a look inside that.
It's difficult given the variance between
I
institutions
know.
and
Michigan
that.
and Middle.
Yeah, exactly. The big three conference schools, I mean, clearly the visibility that they have is a huge plus. It is nice to be able to say, I'm considering Wisconsin and everybody knows Wisconsin. It's a bit more frustrating to say I'm considering Middlebury. And while those of us in education know that it's one of the best institutions in the country, it might not
Yes.
have the name brand awareness across the entire country. And so it's a pretty old challenge to try to decide how much are we really prioritizing this to try to what I consider for most institutions to kind of prime the pump. When it comes to marketing, it helps to be known first and foremost. It helps to be able to know how to say the name of the school. I've worked with schools that get
Mm,
frustrated that people don't know how to even pronounce the name of our
right.
school, and those are top small liberal arts colleges in the top 10. And so there are some challenges there to just being known, but ultimately to really drive enrollment, to generate more than just applications, but to actually fill seats with students that want to be there. And importantly, as David said, persist through to graduation. You need to build a broader culture, a culture based on something broader than just athletics.
Okay.
Go under the hood on the data on that question, Karen, using more sophisticated techniques than asking kids, what do you care about? Which gets you,
Mhm.
by the way, normally an answer that's rather biased. When you look at these questions but through that lens, you'll see that at least nationally, broadly, athletics and school spirit, even on a broader basis, don't tend to end up as powerful determinants of where a student chooses to enroll. And what we're observing is they can be part of something much more powerful. So for instance, if you think about a student athlete, she may be looking for her peeps, for a community. She may be looking for where kids are ambitious. She may be looking for something that drives her in her day. She's going to find that on the team she's playing on.
Mm-hmm.
To
Mm-hmm.
her, there's a larger set of things that others are also interested in that for her play out in her participation in athletics, but in others may play out in something entirely different. So when I use that example, what I'm getting at is in an attempt to try to answer the broad question. I think if you take Craig's point, we need to figure out at any institution what the drivers really are, and then determine the extent to which athletics narrowly and school spirit more broadly can contribute to satisfying those criteria. And that'll differ broadly from one institution to another.
Yeah.
But
And that's
that's the question. That's the
And
question
that's
for the
why
leader.
research like this is so important,
Yeah.
and that's why I wanted to draw it to the attention of presidents to get them to think more broadly, because I think athletics has become a kind of a shorthand trying to solve
Mhm.
these issues. And
Yeah.
as you've said so well in the report and here today, it is part of the answer, but it's not the
Mhm.
whole answer. So,
And you can flip that too. It could be part of the blame, but not the whole blame. For those you were talking about before, and it may include some faculty members, but it may include a whole lot of other people in all kinds of
that's
different
right.
walks of life
That's right.
who will say, well, athletics are the problems that created all the problems there are. And
That's right.
it's just untrue.
Yeah.
These are
Yeah.
complex systems we're talking about.
100%. 100%. Craig, David, I can't thank you so much. First, for your great work on this report. And as I said to my audience, I'll link it in the show notes, but also for your passion. I know you both have a passion for this industry. I know you both also have a passion for sports, which I'm thrilled about. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's
Thanks for
wonderful
having us,
being with
Karen.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.